There's a body of water sitting on the border of Nevada and Arizona that has been keeping secrets for over 50 years. Not the kind of secrets that get filed away in dusty courtrooms or whispered about in history books. The kind of secrets that were never supposed to surface. The kind that were deliberately buried beneath hundreds of feet of cold, dark water, placed there by men who understood one fundamental truth about this particular reservoir, that it was deep enough, that it was remote enough, that it would hold. They were right. For decades, it held everything they gave it, and then the water started to disappear. What happened next is not just a crime story, it is not just an environmental story, it is not just a drought story. What happened when Lake Mead began to recede is something far more unsettling than any single category can contain. Because when the water dropped far enough, it did not just expose a shoreline, it exposed an entire hidden chapter of American history, one that had been deliberately submerged, locked away beneath the surface of the largest man-made reservoir in the United States, left there by people who assumed the water would rise again before anyone ever had to answer for what they had done. They were wrong about that part. Think about what it means when a lake starts to tell the truth. Lake Mead was created in 1936 when the Hoover Dam was completed on the Colorado River, holding back the full force of one of the American West's most powerful waterways. For nearly a century, it has sat at the heart of an invisible infrastructure that most people never think about. A system that delivers water to more than 40 million people across 7 states, multiple Native American tribal nations, agricultural industries that feed much of the nation, and communities stretching all the way south into Mexico. Arizona, California, Nevada, Colorado, New Mexico, Utah, Wyoming, all of them drinking from the same source. All of them connected to the same body of water. All of them, in ways they may not fully appreciate, connected to the same vanishing act. But here is where it gets worse. The water has been vanishing for more than 2 decades. This is not a sudden crisis. This is a slow-motion catastrophe that has been building since the early 2000s, accelerated by a combination of factors so interconnected and so relentless that experts have begun reaching for words like unprecedented and catastrophic without any sense of exaggeration. The Colorado River Basin has been locked in what hydrologists now describe as the worst drought in at least 200 years, a number that requires a moment to sit with. Not the worst drought in living memory, not the worst drought in modern history, the worst drought in 12 centuries, the worst conditions this region has experienced since before the Norman conquest of England, before the Crusades, before gunpowder reached Europe. And it is still getting worse. As of April 2026, Lake Mead sits at approximately 1,060 feet in elevation, roughly 1/3 of its full capacity. According to the Bureau of Reclamation, which oversees the management of the Colorado River's water delivery system, the reservoir could potentially fall to a record low elevation of 1,036 feet by 2026, if current trends continue. The Southern Nevada Water Authority has confirmed that, as of late 2025, the lake sat at just under 35% of its capacity, and officials warned it could drop another 16 or more feet before the end of the year. Federal forecasters have now gone further, projecting that if the drought persists at its current intensity, Lake Mead could fall below its previous record lows as early as 2027. Read that again. The largest reservoir in the United States, 1/3 full, potentially setting new record lows within the next 12 months. What most people are not seeing is the compounding nature of this crisis. In 2025, record low snowpack in the Rocky Mountains, the primary source of the Colorado River's water, was followed almost immediately by a devastating early heat wave in March, what one assistant Utah state climatologist described as a knockout punch for the river system. The snowmelt that would normally feed the reservoirs through spring and summer simply evaporated before it could reach the water. Drought conditions in the western United States now cover approximately 58% of the region. Denver Water recently approved emergency drought pricing that will raise outdoor water bills for roughly 5 million customers, a ripple effect that makes visible what the water managers have understood for years, that what happens at Lake Mead does not stay at Lake Mead. And this is where everything changes, because while the politicians negotiate and the hydrologists model, and the water managers scramble to rewrite the guidelines that have governed the Colorado River since 2007, guidelines that are set to expire at the end of 2026, guidelines that 7 states and multiple tribal nations are currently trying to replace before the entire system collapses. While all of that is happening in conference rooms and federal offices and legislative chambers, the lake itself has been quietly conducting its own investigation, revealing its own evidence, surfacing its own witnesses. On May 1st, 2022, a couple was docking their boat near Hemingway Harbor at Lake Mead when a woman nearby began to scream. They looked over to see what had caused it. There, on the newly exposed mud of the receding shoreline, sat a corroded steel barrel, the kind used for industrial storage, now rusted beyond recognition after decades of submersion. National Park Service rangers responded to the scene. When they looked inside the barrel, they found skeletal human remains, a man's body, clothed in items that forensic investigators would later determine had been purchased at Kmart stores in the mid to late 1970s. His shoes were size 11, extra wide, dark in color with white stripes and Velcro closures, a detail that seems almost unbearably mundane until you understand what it means. It means someone who was alive in 1976 or 1977 or 1978 put those shoes on one morning and never came home. It means someone waited for him. And it means that other people knew exactly what had happened and chose, with great deliberation and organizational precision, to put his body in a barrel, transport it by boat several hundred yards out into the lake, and drop it into what was then approximately 100 feet of water. Las Vegas Police Homicide Lieutenant Ray Spencer confirmed the cause of death almost immediately. The victim had been shot in the head, execution style. This was not an accident. This was not a missing person case. This was a homicide, a professionally conducted homicide. But here's where it gets worse. According to informed sources and expert investigators who have spent decades studying the organized crime networks that once controlled Las Vegas, the manner of disposal was not improvised. Placing a murder victim in a sealed steel barrel and submerging it in deep water is a technique with a specific history and a specific pedigree. The Mob Museum in Las Vegas, the institution dedicated to documenting the relationship between organized crime and American law enforcement, noted immediately that the case bore striking similarities to the 1976 murder of Johnny Roselli, a Chicago outfit figure with deep Las Vegas connections, who had been killed in Florida and disposed of in almost exactly the same manner. Experts at the museum identified 3 possible victims who might be the man in the barrel, each of them men with documented ties to organized crime who disappeared during the late 1970s and early 1980s, and whose bodies were never recovered. The most discussed candidate is George J. Vandermark, a gambling machine specialist who had been trusted by the Chicago outfit to oversee its slot machine operation at the Stardust Hotel and Casino on the Las Vegas Strip. A position of enormous trust that he ultimately betrayed when he was discovered skimming profits that were supposed to flow upward to the crime families. Men who stole from the outfit did not typically have the opportunity to make amends. Vandermark disappeared. He was never found. Another figure whose disappearance fits the timeline is Johnny Pappas, who managed the Echo Bay Resort near Lake Mead and was suspected of similarly redirecting income meant for his Chicago bosses. Former Colombo crime family captain Michael Franzese, who spent significant time in Las Vegas during the 1970s and 1980s, confirmed that the lake was widely known within certain circles as a useful disposal site, noting the 1976 disappearance of Pappas after his skimming was discovered. Think about what that means. Men who ran hotels on the shores of Lake Mead were using the lake itself as a cemetery. The water that people were swimming in, the water that people were boating on, the water that was already beginning its slow journey through the Hoover Dam turbines and into the pipes of Las Vegas homes. That water had bodies in it. The real story is that the first barrel was just the beginning. Within a week of the initial discovery, 2 sisters from the Las Vegas suburb of Henderson were paddleboarding near Colville Bay, more than 9 miles from where the barrel had been found. And when they spotted something on a newly surfaced sandbar, they thought at first it was the skeleton of a bighorn sheep, which are native to the region. Then they saw the human jaw, with teeth. They took photographs and called park rangers. The National Park Service confirmed human remains, a second set. By August of that same year, 4 separate sets of human skeletal remains had been discovered at Lake Mead in a span of just 4 months, as the reservoir continued to suffer from what had by then become a 22-year drought, with water levels at only 27% of capacity. Las Vegas Police Lieutenant Ray Spencer had warned from the very beginning that more would follow. I would say there is a very good chance, as the water level drops, that we are going to find additional human remains, he told local television reporters in May 2022. He was not speaking speculatively. He was speaking from an understanding of what the lake had been used for and how much water still remained to recede. By the time investigators were accounting for 6 sets of skeletal remains, stories about missing mob victims from the 1970s and 1980s were resurfacing alongside them. Michael Green, a professor of history at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, articulated the situation with a clarity that is almost poetic in its grimness. They would have boats on the lake for celebrities, high rollers, people willing to pay for it, he said. So there was always this connection with Lake Mead as a recreation area, and then eventually Lake Mead as the water supply. And now the water supply is dropping, so the bodies are bobbing up. Bodies bobbing up from a water supply. Let that image stay with you for a moment. The Chicago outfit's presence in Las Vegas during this period is not folklore. It is documented history. Tony the Ant Spilotro, one of the most feared and violent figures in organized crime history, was sent to Las Vegas by the Chicago outfit in 1971 to serve as its representative on the ground. to watch over the crime family's secret interests in the casinos, to manage the street rackets, and to ensure that the millions of dollars being quietly siphoned from Las Vegas gambling operations made their way back to crime families in Chicago, Kansas City, Milwaukee, and Cleveland. This operation, known as skimming, was one of the most sophisticated financial crimes in American history. The money was taken before it was counted, before it appeared in any ledger, before the tax authorities or the Gaming Commission could see it. It simply disappeared, rerouted through a network of trust and violence that Spilotro maintained through the most elemental of management tools, the credible threat of death for anyone who stepped out of line. And here is where it gets worse. The men who disappeared, the men whose bones may now be sitting in evidence bags in Clark County, were not innocent bystanders. They were participants in the system who had violated its rules. They had stolen from the people who were already stealing. And in that world, the punishment was not a lawsuit or a termination. It was a rusted barrel and 100 feet of cold, dark water. It was the assumption that the lake would never give them back. Investigators confirmed that the barrel containing the first set of remains had been transported by boat several hundred yards out into the lake and dumped in what was then approximately 100 feet of water. This was not a crime of passion. This was logistics. This was planning. Someone measured the depth, someone sourced the barrel, someone organized the boat, and then someone watched it sink and drove back to Las Vegas with the reasonable confidence that the matter was closed permanently. The Colorado River had other plans, or rather, the absence of the Colorado River did. What the men who dumped those barrels could not have anticipated, what no one in the 1970s could have reasonably anticipated, was that the American West was entering the beginning stages of a water crisis so severe that it would eventually drain their hiding place. The drought that began tightening around the Colorado River basin at the turn of the 21st century is now understood to be a consequence of two overlapping forces: a natural long-term climate cycle that has historically brought dry periods to the Southwest, and the accelerating effects of human-caused climate change, which is raising temperatures, reducing snowpack, drying soils, and increasing the evaporative demand on every body of water in the region. What climate scientists describe as the worst drought in 200 years is not a natural disaster in the traditional sense. It is a collision between geological time and human time, between natural cycles that play out over centuries, and industrial activity that has compressed a century's worth of atmospheric change into the last few decades. The result is Lake Mead, 1/3 full, still dropping, still revealing. The federal government's response to the crisis has been both aggressive and insufficient, a combination that tells you everything about the scale of the problem. In 2022, Nevada, Arizona, California, and the federal government reached a $200 million agreement to try to keep more water in Lake Mead by paying farmers, tribes, and municipalities to reduce their water use voluntarily. The Inflation Reduction Act allocated additional funds for conservation programs in the Colorado River Basin, with Arizona alone expected to reduce its consumption by 360,000 acre-feet per year, enough water to supply several 100,000 households. The Bureau of Reclamation asked the 7 Colorado River states to commit to reducing consumption by at least 2 million acre-feet per year. They offered roughly half that amount. Half. When the system requires 2 million and the states offer 1 million, that gap does not disappear through goodwill. It disappears through the lake. The current operating guidelines that govern how Lake Mead and Lake Powell, the 2 giant Colorado River reservoirs that function as the system's central storage, are managed, were written in 2007 and are set to expire at the end of 2026. The negotiation to replace them is currently underway, involving all 7 states, multiple tribal nations, Mexico, and the federal government. The Bureau of Reclamation's acting commissioner David Palumbo said in 2025 that the process underscores the importance of immediate action to secure the future of the Colorado River, adding that the new guidelines must be robust enough to withstand ongoing drought and poor runoff conditions to ensure water security for more than 40 million people who rely on this vital resource. 40 million people. That is the number that must be held in mind when understanding what is happening at Lake Mead. The bodies in the barrels are the visible symbol of what the lake's disappearance reveals, but the invisible consequence, the one that does not generate headlines about mob murders and forensic investigations, is the slow, grinding erosion of water security for a population roughly the size of California. The population that drinks from the Colorado River is not concentrated in one place. It is spread across an enormous geography, from the ski towns of Colorado to the subdivisions of Phoenix, from the farms of the Imperial Valley to the hotels of Las Vegas, from the indigenous communities of the Four Corners region to the factories of San Diego. They are all connected to the same pipe, and the source of that pipe is a lake sitting at 1/3 capacity. According to the Bureau of Reclamation's most recent projections, Lake Mead could reach a record low elevation of 1,036 feet by 2026, a level that would threaten the ability of Hoover Dam's turbines to generate hydroelectric power. Hoover Dam is not just a water delivery system. It is a power plant. It generates enough electricity to serve approximately 3 million people annually, supplying power to Nevada, Arizona, and California. If the water drops below the minimum level required for the turbines to function, a level known in water management terminology as dead pool, then Hoover Dam stops producing electricity. The water would still exist in the reservoir, but it would be inaccessible through the existing infrastructure. The cities downstream would not receive their water. The turbines would go silent. This is not a hypothetical. Water managers have been running the numbers, and the numbers lead to this possibility with increasing frequency. Southern Nevada has already constructed an emergency low lake level pumping station specifically designed to draw water from the lake, even when levels fall below what existing infrastructure can access, a multi-$100 million investment in the engineering equivalent of a life preserver. Las Vegas has already shifted its water intake to draw from deeper within the reservoir. Federal forecasts indicate the reservoir could fall below its previous record lows by late 2027, following years of diminished runoff linked to persistent drought and warming temperatures. And this is where everything changes again. Because the water crisis and the crime investigation are not separate stories. They are the same story told from different angles. The lake is drying up, and in drying up, it is becoming a forensic archive. It is revealing things that were placed inside it under the assumption that it would always be full enough to hide them. Every foot of water that evaporates from the surface of Lake Mead is another foot closer to whatever else is down there. And according to law enforcement officials, investigators, and organized crime historians, there is almost certainly more to find. Former Las Vegas Mayor Oscar Goodman, who before his political career spent decades as a defense attorney representing some of the most powerful organized crime figures in the country, including Tony Spilotro himself, was asked what he thought about the discoveries. His response was characteristically direct. "There's no telling what we'll find in Lake Mead," he said. "It's not a bad place to dump a body." He noted that the mob figures he had known would not have needed to travel to Lake Mead specifically for this purpose. The desert outside Las Vegas provides its own options, but acknowledged that the lake offered a particular kind of depth and permanence that the desert cannot guarantee. The victim in the barrel, the man in the Kmart shoes, shot in the head, sealed in a steel drum and sunk in water that was then 100 feet deep, remains unidentified as of 2026. DNA was recovered from the remains. But DNA without a database match is a code that cannot be read. The Clark County Coroner's Office has been working to identify him for years, appealing to the public, releasing photographs of the distinctive shoes, building a profile of a man who was somewhere between his late 20s and his 40s when he was killed, who shopped at discount stores, who wore size 11 shoes, and who was connected in some way to the world that operated in the shadows of Las Vegas's casinos during the most violent decade in the city's history. He has not been identified. His killers have not been named. And given that the likely perpetrators of this killing would themselves now be in their 70s or 80s or no longer living, the prospect of a criminal prosecution becomes more theoretical with every passing year. This is what time does to justice. It does not just delay it. It dissolves it. It turns it into history, into archaeology, into a forensic mystery that investigators sift through with the same tools they use to examine ancient burial sites: carbon dating, skeletal analysis, material culture, context. The context here is a lake that is still dropping. What most people are not seeing is the broader implication of what is happening at Lake Mead. The United States has never faced a water crisis at this scale in the modern era. The Colorado River Compact, the agreement that governs how the river's water is divided among the 7 states, was signed in 1922 during an unusually wet period that caused the negotiators to significantly overestimate how much water the river could reliably deliver. They allocated more water than the river actually produces in an average year. For a century, that overallocation was masked by wet periods and by the enormous storage capacity of Lake Mead and Lake Powell. The reservoirs acted as buffers, absorbing the excess in good years and releasing it in dry ones. But 2 decades of drought have drawn down those buffers to the point where the system is no longer functioning as designed. The river cannot meet the obligations that the states have assumed. According to informed sources within the water management community, the negotiations over the post-2026 Colorado River Guidelines are among the most consequential policy discussions currently taking place in the American West, more significant in the long run than any single election or any single piece of legislation. Because water is not a policy question that can be resolved through compromise in the way that most policy questions can. You cannot negotiate with evaporation. You cannot vote against drought. You can only make choices about who gets less water and accept the political consequences of those choices. Arizona has already been cut. Nevada has already been cut. The reductions agreed to in 2022 and extended through 2025 represent the largest voluntary water use reductions in the history of the Colorado River Compact. And they have not been enough to stabilize the reservoirs. The lake is still at 1/3 capacity. The projections still point downward. The bodies are still surfacing. Here's the question that nobody in the water management system wants to ask out loud. What happens to Phoenix if Lake Mead reaches Deadpool? Phoenix is the 5th largest city in the United States, with a metropolitan population exceeding 5 million people, located in the middle of a desert, almost entirely dependent on the Colorado River and its associated infrastructure for its water supply. The city has spent decades building alternative water sources, reclaimed water, groundwater banking, canal systems, but its fundamental relationship with the Colorado River is not something that can be engineered away in a short time frame. If the water stops flowing from Hoover Dam, the consequences would ripple through the Phoenix metro area in ways that would redefine what life looks like in the American Southwest. But this is not chaos. This is a trajectory, a slow, measurable, documented trajectory that scientists have been tracking for 20 years, and that policymakers have been responding to with a combination of genuine effort and structural inadequacy. The genuine effort is real. The conservation programs, the water banking, the emergency infrastructure, the negotiations. The structural inadequacy is also real. The gap between what is needed and what is politically achievable, the gap between the water the states are entitled to under the 1922 Compact, and the water the river can actually deliver. And running through all of it, surfacing from the depths of all of it, are the bodies. The man in the barrel, the bones on the sandbar, the skeleton at Swim Beach. The 4th set of remains found in August 2022 after park rangers responded to a call from Swim Beach. The 5th, the 6th. Each one a separate story, a separate vanishing, a separate crime that was committed with the lake as an accomplice, and that the lake is now, decades later, refusing to continue to conceal. Forensic investigators have noted that even if they can gather the best possible evidence from these remains, identification requires something to compare against. A DNA profile, a missing person record, a family member who has wondered for 40 years what happened. Without that comparison, the most sophisticated forensic science in the world cannot put a name to a face that has been underwater since the Carter administration. And so the man in the barrel remains nameless. The lake continues to fall. The negotiations over the river's future continue in rooms where the stakes are measured in millions of acre-feet, and the decisions will determine whether the Southwest remains inhabitable for the population it currently holds. The criminal investigation continues in a Clark County coroner's office where a pair of size 11 Velcro sneakers sits in an evidence bag, waiting to tell someone what it knows. What the lake is telling us, in the language of receding water and surfacing remains and federal shortage declarations and emergency pumping stations, is something that cuts beneath the individual crime stories and beneath the individual policy debates. It is telling us that the assumptions on which a civilization was built are no longer reliable. The assumption that the water would always be there. The assumption that what is placed deep enough beneath the surface will stay hidden. The assumption that what was agreed to a century ago can still govern what happens today. None of those assumptions are holding. The men who dumped those barrels in the 1970s assumed the water would protect their secrets forever. The planners who built Phoenix and Las Vegas and Los Angeles assumed the Colorado River would provide for them indefinitely. The negotiators who signed the 1922 Compact assumed they were dividing an abundant resource that would always regenerate. All of them were wrong in the same fundamental way. They trusted the future to resemble the past. They trusted stability in a system that was never stable, only patient. The lake is at 1/3 capacity. It is still dropping. The Bureau of Reclamation projects it could reach record lows within the next 2 years. 7 states and multiple tribal nations are negotiating over rules that will govern a river that can no longer fulfill the promises made in its name. And somewhere on the lake bed, in the silt, in the dark, there are things that have not yet surfaced, things that were placed there under the protection of depth and time and the assumption of permanence. The depth is gone, the time has run out. What remains to be revealed, and when, is the only question left that nobody can answer.